Well, the young are getting restless, or to hear my next guest tell it, just clueless. And he's young, worried about his fellow generation, just fine with government, and particularly big government. It's no surprise that young like Washington doing more. What is a surprise is how much more. We're going to get to that gentleman in a moment. First to Chris Saltis Anderson, Julie Rajitsky, and the guy I was talking about, Ron Meyer. Ron, your generation seems to defy you. What do you make of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Frankly, it's really because conservatives don't reach out to college campuses. But the problem is we've had 4 years of Obama. What have young people got? Last month, youth unemployment went to 17.6%, up 2% in 1 month alone. And what we've seen is that now only 6 in 10 millennials have jobs, right? After graduating, only 6 in 10 of them have jobs.
So they shouldn't like the president, yet they seem to like the government that by and large is espoused by Democrats and this president.
Well, that's right. It's because of the education system. It's because of President Obama. And frankly, it's because conservatives and Republicans aren't actually trying to talk to young people. We have a few people like me and a couple other folks in the movement who actually try to reach out to young people. But as a whole, we're not doing it. We have to. We have to try to talk to young people. We have to talk about their pocketbooks. They want jobs. They want employment. I have friends who are desperate, unemployed, or underemployed who want jobs, and we have to reach out to them. If we are upset that young people aren't following us, we should ask, what are we doing wrong as well? Not just, well, they're idiots. We should say, well, what can we do to reach out to them? What can we do to convey our message better? Everyone knows the Republican Party has a communication message, and I think it's best shown to this demographic.
Well, I don't know. Julie, as a Democratic strategist here, I'm wondering, isn't it just the case that young people tend to be more liberal anyway, and we're overanalyzing it?
Yeah, what did Churchill say? If you're young and liberal, you don't have a heart. If you're old and conservative, you're not conservative, you don't have a brain. I mean, that's sort of you evolve.
Churchill.
I think Churchill said that. I think, had a very good point, which is Republicans aren't focused on the right stuff. They're focused on personal social issues. When you're telling...
But when that ratio is 60-40 Democrats over Republican preference among young people, that's disproportionately.
Not a surprise to me, though, because, again, what young people are hearing is that, single women overwhelmingly voted for Obama. When you're focused on social issues, when you're focused on transvaginal probes, when you're focused on men...
This is a family show.
A family, it's sadly, this is the kind of stuff we have to talk about. But I mean, we don't have to talk about it, but Republicans talk about it.
But Chris, what do you make of that? What she's saying there, that Republicans are not reaching out to young people, or at least even speaking their language, and it's hurting them.
I completely agree that Republicans need to do much more in reaching out to young voters.
Like what? How should they reach out? What should they say?
What they need to reach out on is about how they're going to solve problems. So one of the big problems Republicans run into is we've started to talk about cutting the size of government as this great end in and of itself. And of course, shrinking the national debt, shrinking the deficits is hugely important. But for many young voters, they've got huge amounts of student loan debt. They can't find a job. And they're asking Republicans, so what's your answer to make my life any better off?
Well, Ron's answer is just put yourself up by your bootstraps and figure it out, right, Ron?
No, that's not the answer. The answer is actually to empower the private sector. The problem is that the government, which is heavily unionized, doesn't employ young people. We've seen the government balloon, and what's happened? Youth unemployment has skyrocketed. So that's what I'm saying. We need to empower the private sector by actually cutting taxes, by cutting government spending. Remember, government spending, the money comes from somewhere, and it comes from a job creator. It comes from someone who would spend that money in the private sector. So every time someone says, well, government spending stimulates the economy, well, where do they get that money from? It destimulates somewhere else, and it destimulates where young people get jobs.
But I will say this. If I'm an 18-year-old kid and I really want to go to college, which most 18-year-old kids who aspire to something want to do, and I look at a party that wants to cut Pell Grants and wants to cut funding for my education, I say these are not the people on my side. And that's, you're right, the Republican Party has a communication problem, but it's also got a policy problem. And the problem seems to be that you're taking away money from education, you're taking away money from student grants.
Well, I don't know if it's that black and white. But Chris, I will say, Julie hits on a point that I think does bear repeating here. The perception is that Republicans have built a reputation as the party of no, and that it comes at a time when a lot of young people, for whatever reason, are embracing a constructive role for bigger government. Now, you can agree or disagree with that, but that clearly is being evidenced in a lot of these polls, that young people are embracing a kinder, gentler, friendlier big government. And how do you disavow them of that notion, if that's your goal, that it could be damaging to them?
I don't think that they're necessarily embracing government. I think they're waiting for someone else to show them what's the other option. So the challenge is to Republicans to talk about non-governmental solutions. How can communities and individuals and businesses come together to solve problems? Going to the issue of college tuition, for instance, why don't Republicans talk a little bit more about what are the drivers that are making college tuition go up and up and up? If you look at the things in our economy that have gotten more and more expensive, where costs have outpaced inflation, it's education and it's health care, things that the government is the primary purchaser of. So why don't Republicans start making more of these arguments about what's really causing the problems that so many young people are facing, and how there are solutions that are not necessarily the government that are going to fix those problems.
But Ron, real quickly, to Julie's point, if you want a loan and you want to get to college, you don't have time for all this nuance. You just want the damn loan, right? And fairly or not, they're getting angry that they're not going to get it from Republicans, right?
It's really not about nuance, actually. It's whether or not you want to have $30,000 in debt, which is what the average graduating student debt is, or whether you actually want to have a future after you graduate college. You want to be able to have a job and actually be able to afford being at that job and not have to go homeless because you have to pay off your student loans. That's the problem a lot of young people are facing. And frankly, I think what Republicans need to say is this. Look back to Ronald Reagan. I know people call us nostalgic for saying this. When Reagan cut taxes, look what happened to youth unemployment. Over his term, it dropped 43%. It went from 18% to 10% over his term. And that's the sort of example we need to show. If we want to get people employed, we need to go back to that Reagan model, cutting domestic spending, cutting taxes, and that will get young people employed.
All right, I want to steal all of you back in later in the show.